Good afternoon from Chicago. I'm Daalder, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you for joining us today for the third virtual gathering of the Pritzker Forum on Global Cities. This will be the final program of the Changing Cities New Reality series. If you happen to have missed our previous programs in the series, you can still watch them on the Pritzker Forum's website, www.globalcitiesforum.org. The Pritzker Forum is a partnership of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and the Financial Times. We've been so pleased to host it together with the FT since 2015. Our annual gatherings here in Chicago have traditionally brought together the world's leading experts to explore how cities can best address global challenges, from climate change to income and wealth inequality to terrorism and other transnational threats. But for the past year, the world and our cities have been rocked by another major global challenge, the COVID-19 pandemic. When the virus first emerged, the Pritzker Forum pivoted to digital programming to explore many important and timely issues at the intersection of cities, health, governance, and equity. Last October, we looked at how cities around the world were delivering services to residents living under our lockdown. And we focused on the interplay between local and national leadership in responding to the challenges of the pandemic. And just this March, we looked at how cities could respond to the many inequities that were laid bare by the pandemic. We hosted mayors from around the world, from Cape Town to New Orleans, to London and LA, and they discussed the disproportionate impact the pandemic has had, particularly on people of color and on women. Secretary Pete Buttigieg joined us to dissect the role of urban transportation in an equitable recovery. And we spoke to Dr. Anthony Fauci about new variants and on vaccine nationalism, even as many in the US were already getting their first shots. Today, we conclude the series by an early look into the post-COVID city. This virus transformed our lives in so many ways, and it has left untold devastation in its wake. It exposed weaknesses in governance and highlighted long-standing and long-ignored inequities in healthcare, employment, and social support. And perhaps most disorienting, the pandemic stripped us of our ability to conduct the most human of acts, to connect with each other. We work, we play, and we live our lives with other people. And COVID took that away for all too many of us this past year. Of course, technology and improvisation quickly stepped in to allow for virtual concerts, Zoom cooking classes, and drive-by birthday celebrations. But the impact of not coming together in person was felt by also too many. Here in the United States, as well as in other advanced countries, restrictions are beginning to ease as case numbers plummet and more people are enjoying the protection of vaccines. Health authorities have updated guidelines on how we can return to work, where we can play, and when we might be able to travel. For those fully vaccinated, we're returning to a sense of normalcy. Of course, the very concept of the post-COVID city is a privilege that can currently be enjoyed by only a few. And yet it's not too early to think about how the post-COVID city can take shape. That will include contemplating a future where we're hugging friends and family once again safely, where we can collaborate in person with our colleagues, and where we can enjoy the arts and culture of our cities in full once again. It's important that we come together across sectors, public and private, to set new standards for gathering safely and to ensure that the hard lessons we've learned from the past year and a half have not been for naught. We also need to think about how the unequal timeliness for attaining the post-COVID city will affect businesses and culture and the arts in those many places that are still struggling to overcome the virus. Today's program will explore how we return to live, work, and play in the post-COVID city. When it comes to living, we'll hear from academics Leslie Kern and Carlos Moreno, about life in our neighborhoods and the revitalization of spaces outside of the central business district. For work, we'll discuss what a resilient workplace and workforce looks like with Brad Smith of Microsoft, Isabella Guzman of the Small Business Administration, and Mary Kay Henry of the Service Employees International Union. And when it comes to play, we will speak with Scott Kirby of the United Airlines and Justine Simons from the City of London about ways to make travel, tourism, and culture more resilient, to ensure the vibrancy we have come to love and expect from global cities worldwide can be enjoyed once again. And finally, we'll hear from Governor Koike of Tokyo about her city's Time of Act initiative to ensure the Summer Olympics can be held safely and successfully in a few months' time. This program and our year-round work on global cities at the Chicago Council are made possible by the generous support of our partners and sponsors, which include the Pritzker Family and Foundation, our lead sponsors AbbVie and UL, our supporting sponsors Kirkland & Ellis and United Airlines, and by the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Our thanks to them and to each of you watching for taking the time to join us today. And now it's my pleasure to welcome our co-host, the U.S. editor of the Financial Times, Peter Spiegel. Peter, we've greatly appreciated our collaboration over the years on global cities and, of course, on the inside from the Financial Times on the pandemic and what it means for our cities.
Thanks, Ivo. Over the Memorial Day weekend, I did something I hadn't done in more than 2 years. I bought tickets to a baseball game. The Mets sent me multiple emails to make sure I wore a mask and filled out a fan information form for contact tracing purposes and didn't sit in the vaccinated fan section since I was bringing my 8-year-old daughter who doesn't qualify for inoculations yet. And in the end, Mother Nature intervened and the game was rained out. But still, the very act of purchasing those tickets felt like a watershed. I was going to do something normal with my family in the wilds of New York City. As everyone here surely knows by now, I wasn't the only one. The last couple of weeks have seen multiple signs that Americans are returning to the activities we once did as a matter of routine. The Transportation Security Administration reported that nearly 2 million people passed through American airports on the Friday before Memorial Day. Not quite what they were in 2019, but a new record for the pandemic era. A Quiet Place Part 2 earned $57 million at the box office over the same weekend, more than A Quiet Place Part 1, and by far the most of any movie has earned during an opening weekend in more than a year. And the CEO of Hilton said his hotels were 93% booked on the Saturday night before Memorial Day, with summer bookings already ahead of the 2019 peak. But this post-pandemic boom that most economists are now predicting will not necessarily mean a boom for our cities. On most days here in New York, subway ridership is still more than 50% below pre-pandemic levels. The latest crime statistics from the NYPD show that shooting incidents are up more than 160% in the last year. Criminologists estimate that homicides in major American cities are up 24% this year, after jumping 30% last year. Anecdotal reporting the FT has done in several big U.S. cities show that while bosses are eager to get their employees back into offices in central business districts, many workers are far less eager to brave their commutes again. And this is in the U.S., where vaccination rates are amongst the highest in the world. This is why today's Pritzker Forum and the topic of post-COVID city are so critically important to tackle and quickly. Will cities return to their pre-pandemic vibrancy as places to live, to work, and to play? And if not, can they adjust to a new normal without reverting to the bad old days, where the educated elites decamp to suburbs, leaving cities stigmatized, short of investment, and short of a tax base? Those of us who believe in our cities, and I count myself amongst them, note that we've been here before. In New York, I've spoken to many development veterans who recall the rebound after the city nearly went bankrupt in the 1970s. And of course, how it rebounded after September 11th. But skeptics point out, and they're not wrong, that there's something fundamentally different about a pandemic. The very things that make our cities great, population density, physical commingling, critical mass, overnight became things that could literally kill us. If our employees choose to remain in some kind of hybrid work model, how do we redesign our workplaces to adjust to that reality? And what happens to the acres of real estate in Midtown Manhattan or inside Chicago's Loop that may become superfluous? If online shopping becomes the norm, a trend that was already underway but turbocharged by lockdowns, what happens to life and security on our main streets, where retailers seem to be shuttering by the dozens with little prospect of reopening? And if the educated and the well-off abandon urban centers for more socially distant suburbs and rural areas, who will support the arts and attend the live events that make cities the place where we want to play? These are big questions that I don't believe policymakers or business leaders have yet answered. But that's why it's so important that we've gathered here today to start grappling with them. Back to you, Ivo.
Thanks, Peter. And now for our final welcome remarks, I'm pleased to introduce Chicago's Mayor, Lori Lightfoot.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot, and I'm proud to be here to discuss our post-pandemic recovery. While it is imperative that we continue encouraging people to get vaccinated and stay safe, the time has come for us to map out our return to a new sense of normalcy and reimagine the ways in which we live, work, and play. My administration has already begun this work by welcoming back our beloved traditions and summertime activities. Thanks to our Open Chicago initiative, residents and tourists can once again gather in our parks, beaches, and meeting spaces for arts, music, and cultural events. As part of this initiative, we're also laying the groundwork to support the return to the office and the reopening of our hospitality industry, schools, small businesses, and so much more. As you engage in discussions on these topics today, I encourage you to think boldly and creatively, because that's how we create the inclusive and resilient recovery that our residents deserve. So thank you all for your participation, and please, everyone, continue to be safe.
Thank you, Mayor Lightfoot. Now, before we move on, I invite you to follow us and engage throughout the forum on Twitter @_globalcities. And now on to our program. The pandemic interrupted so many of our lives and living patterns, forcing many of us into our homes and limiting any outside activity to grocery shopping and neighborhood walks. With a lull in traffic and downtown commutes, some cities undertook much-needed neighborhood improvement projects, and others adopted pedestrian-friendly policies, including pop-up dining streets and new bike lanes. But not all neighborhoods are created equal, and not all initiatives will be permanent. As people begin to venture out of their homes and back into the city for work and play, how do we ensure our neighborhoods retain the best characteristics from the past 18 months? To discuss the revitalization of our neighborhoods and places outside of the Central Business District, I'm pleased to introduce our first moderator, Claire Bushey, Chicago correspondent for the Financial Times, who will be in conversation with Leslie Kern, author of Feminist City, and Carlos Moreno, Paris Mayor Hidalgo's special envoy for smart cities. Claire, over to you.
Thanks, Ivo. It's great to join the Pritzker Forum. The pandemic has fundamentally changed the way we experience our cities. As it ebbs, there's this question out there of what do we need to do to reinvigorate urban life and build cities that are both more resilient and more just. In this panel, we're going to talk about cities in terms of public space and urban design. We have Carlos Moreno here to discuss the concept of the 15-minute city, and Leslie Kern to talk about the feminist city. The pandemic has forced us to rethink the notion that we live in neighborhoods and we work in the Central Business District. Carlos, you work with city planners to help implement this idea of the proximity city, that you can get most of your needs for work, for school, for shopping, recreation, met within a 15-minute travel radius, or 20 minutes, or 30. What are the major difficulties that cities face when they're trying to switch from their current setup to multi-use or hybrid neighborhoods?
Thank you for your kind invitation. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. I think that today, around the world, we have been facing two significant problems. On the one hand, the climate change. This is a very big threat for humanity. And on the other hand, in extreme urbanizations under the time of the COVID-19 with this pandemic crisis. The 15-minute concept is a new idea in order to fight against climate change with low CO2 carbon emissions, because we want to reduce our mobility for providing the access in the vicinity to the essential urban social functions: to live, to work, to supply, to care, to learn, and to enjoy. We consider that in the different cities, despite of the size of the city, we need to develop this new proximity, because we could live under the pandemic crisis in a health cities, and we could develop this city as a human scale.
So what is hard, though, about taking what we already have built and getting it to this model of the proximity city? Because it's very different.
Yes, in fact, we have today in different cities, for example, in a city as Paris, in a city as Milan in Italy, and Latin America, Buenos Aires, for example. We have the different city, but at the same time, we have the same challenges to reduce our CO2 emissions, to develop the healthy cities, to build a new model for living differently in the different continents. We have been accepting until now the unacceptable, to live with the unsustainable city. We need today to develop the proximity in a decentralized city for living differently, with the polycentric city, in a multi-service city, provide, for example, jobs close to home, for providing the short circuits for supplying, to develop the health center in the proximity, to reconcile our proximity with the nature, for having green cities, for having water. In reality, we need to propose the new mobilities by foot or by bike in the pedestrian areas, for developing the new urban services in the proximity. We needed to shift the urban paradigm for improving the quality of life. We needed to stop, to continue to lost our time for moving during 1 hour for joining my office from my home. We have the possibility today to rediscover the proximity, to explore the proximity, the outdoor spaces, the indoor spaces. The key word is the hybridization. With the hybridization, we have the possibility to live differently with our resources in this vicinity, in the happy proximity.
You actually brought up something that I wanted to ask about. I think we all can agree that during lockdown, we experienced the importance of outdoor public spaces. Parks, though, are not distributed equally across the city, and they don't have equal amenities, and they aren't maintained equally. Leslie, can you give us a sense of what we all need in our public spaces to make sure that it is truly inviting for everyone?
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. I think many people found during the pandemic, as we were urged to spend more time outside, that a lot of our urban environments were not very humane, if you will, that we have either taken away or never really invested in the kind of infrastructure that makes people comfortable. Some of this is very simple: places to sit, shelter, shade, access to water, and everybody's favorite topic, access to restrooms. So in order to really encourage this, we need to kind of build back more caring, human, playful, sociable spaces into our cities. And as you mentioned, we do also have to take a hard look about which areas, which neighborhoods have access to high quality public space and which are still struggling to have kind of any green space, any public space at all. So we do really have to think carefully about an equitable distribution of those things, not just focus on putting them in, the main downtown tourist center, for example, or in wealthier neighborhoods, because I think often in lower income neighborhoods where people live in apartment buildings, for example, there's perhaps even an even greater need for that high quality, sociable urban public space.
Many cities fast-tracked changes to public spaces during the pandemic. Everything from, pop-up dining and pedestrian-only streets to bicycle superhighways. And it's been really good in terms of reducing carbon dioxide emissions, encouraging healthy lifestyles. But Carlos, do you think this is temporary, or do you think this is the beginning of a larger shift, or temporary?
I am totally convinced that today we have been shifting towards a new paradigm. In reality, in my opinion, the most important point is to rediscover at the same time the proximity, our resources for living differently, and in particular, this is the case in the city of Paris, to propose the urban common good as a guideline for developing the new services for the citizen dwellers. The common good is the possibility for proposing, for example, the social housing, for developing the commercial property of the city in order to avoid the gentrification. With the price for renting the square meters for commerce below the speculative real estate market. The common good is as well the participatory budget. 10% of the budget of the city of Paris is totally oriented for the participatory budget, 800 million euros for people, for citizen dwellers, for civic association, in order to propose the local projects, and the city for the winners will fund these projects for transforming our city. I think that when we have the possibility not only to transform with the pop-up bike lines, with the temporary pop-ups, but we have the possibility to develop a middle-term strategy based on the urban common good. We have the possibility to propose a new urban strategy for fighting against the pandemic crisis, and to develop a new green roadmap for fighting against climate change.
As you mentioned, proximity is valuable. It can be a commodity, particularly when it comes to access to housing. People pay more when they can be close to the things that they want. Leslie, you've written about how gentrification prioritizes the safety and comfort of white women, to say nothing about the powerful players, generally male, who profit through neighborhood change. If we move towards this idea of the 15-minute city, what can policymakers do to make sure that we're not displacing the people who live in these neighborhoods now?
It's such an important question. And for me, as a feminist urbanist, the idea of the 15-minute city overlaps so well with things that women and feminists have been arguing for a long time would be so important for gender equity, because women's journeys through the city and struggling to balance care work and paid work, the lack of proximity has been a real barrier, a real source of struggle for so many. But as you suggest here, we have to be really careful in our kind of capitalist urban land markets that we don't end up making these 15-minute areas kind of a new urban amenity. I think some people, some very lucky people, are already living this reality, but many people have been further displaced from such neighborhoods, from good transportation links, from good quality schools, and from proximity to employment because of gentrification processes. So what can we do about it? Well, cities need to ensure that within these polycentric areas that there is a good mix of housing, that current tenants are protected and are not vulnerable to displacement through eviction or redevelopment processes. We have to maintain really good and affordable public transportation links between neighborhoods, because not everybody will be able to do everything within their 15-minute neighborhood. And I think we have to be attentive to equity issues such as gender, because we realize that not everybody's lives look the same. So what works in a 15-minute sense for one person might not for somebody else. So paying attention to that variety of needs is really key.
How you said that there's overlap, and I'm curious to sort of know more about what some of that overlap is. How do you think, and this is something for both of you, how do you think the feminist city and the 15-minute city could lead, if we were to implement those models, it could lead to greater equality and vibrancy in the post-COVID metropolis?
Well, if I might start, I would pick up on something that Carlos mentioned about more pedestrian areas, more bike lanes, more public transportation routes. These are really key climate-wise. They're also, gendered, race and class issues in terms of the people who are more likely to use public transportation, to take more pedestrian journeys, and to take more bike journeys. So there is a nice match with kind of equity principles. For so long, especially in North American cities, we've really over-prioritized the car at the expense of all of these other transportation modes. And honestly, it's more likely to be men who benefit from that and white men who benefit from that than other groups. So when we expand those options, when we build in better mobility and better proximity, we are also achieving equity goals as well, because it recognizes what is more likely to be the norm for more marginalized groups in our cities.
How is it that Building for Cars prioritizes the needs of white men?
Well, research shows that men are more likely to have more access to a single vehicle. Women are more likely to be public transportation users, and women are more likely to take more and longer pedestrian journeys throughout the day, probably as a result of doing things like dropping the children at school, then getting on transportation to go to their job, hopping off to pick up diapers and milk, and doing the journey in return. Women are also more economically less well off than men typically in most places, so they don't necessarily have the means to sustain access to a private vehicle. So even though it's not explicitly a sexist policy, it can be a sexist policy in its result when we over prioritize cars.
Carlos, what do you think?
We need to develop this concept of the proximity, in particular with the public spaces, in order to offer the democracy, transparency for using of the public spaces, and to improve, in particular, the gender equity for these activities in the public space. In the city of Paris, for example, the deputy mayor in charge of public spaces has been developing a very hard working in order to define how could we offer better access for women, for kids in the public spaces. In reality, until now, several public spaces are very oriented for males, for men. We need to transform this situation, and we need to transform in the way for proposing activities, for proposing equipments with these capabilities for promoting the safety access in the day, but in the twilight period in the day and in the night, and we need to transform this equity, this gender equity in the concrete reality. For that, we need to develop the actions with the civic actors, with the associations. I think that we need to practice a collaborative urbanism with the users, and in particular with the human user that uses the public spaces.
That makes a lot of sense. Both of you made such excellent points. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. I'm afraid this is all we have time for, but there is lots more programming to come. So back to you, Ivo.
Thank you, Leslie, Carlos, and Claire, for that fascinating look at how we can rethink our neighborhoods and public spaces. As lovely as spending time close to home has been for many of us, one of the reasons we may be leaving our neighborhoods is to return to the office. Some among us, those deemed essential, of course, never stopped going to work and kept our cities and lives running, while still others have cycled between going to work and staying at home as their businesses responded to closing and reopening orders. To discuss how we all can work in the post-COVID city, I'll hand the discussion over to Andrew Edgecliffe-Johnson, the FT's U.S. business editor, for a discussion with Administrator Guzman of the Small Business Administration, Mary Kay Henry, President of the Service Employees International Union, and Brad Smith, President of Microsoft.
Thank you very much, Ivo. And welcome to our panel on sustaining a resilient workforce. I'm Andrew Edgecliffe-Johnson, US Business Editor of the Financial Times, and I'm delighted to be joined today, if only virtually, by Isabella Guzman, Administrator of the Small Business Administration, Mary Kay Henry, International President of the 2 million member strong Service Employees International Union, and Brad Smith, President of Microsoft. Now, we all know the pandemic has changed our city's relationship with their workforces. It's affected businesses large and small, and it's shown up vulnerabilities and inequities that affect everybody from the lowest wage essential workers to highly mobile knowledge workers. How we all work in future is going to play a huge part in determining the success or failure of our largest cities. So we have a lot to cover under this banner. We're going to dive straight in without delay and start talking about the return to work, which is a very live issue for all of us. Now, by June last year, around the peak of the pandemic in the US, about 40% of Americans were working from home full time. It was a necessary pandemic response, obviously for public health reasons and the economy, but it also emptied out many of our city's central business districts and made employees rethink where they want to live and how they want to work longer term. Brad Smith, if I could start with you, how has remote work gone for your employees at Microsoft? And how do you think a company like Microsoft loses anything if too many of its people remain working remotely for too long?
Well, I think in some ways remote work has gone better than we could have expected. And in other ways, we all lose something when we're not together, at least on some kind of frequent basis in person. It is a wonder to see how much more we can accomplish than I think we probably thought. And I think it's good to think about some of the conveniences that this kind of remote activity can bring to all of us. A telehealth visit with a health practitioner, an ability to connect with a teacher, if not in a classroom during the day, for homework help after the school day is done. But I think we all lose something, and I think if we fail to note that, we're sort of missing something very important. The city was in some ways humanity's first invention. It was at least civilization's first invention. It's been around for 6,000 years, and for good reason. And I was reminded of that when I saw people come together for the first meeting we had of my team in person at Microsoft earlier this week. You know, it's really nice when people can laugh and they're not on mute. They can laugh together. They can applaud together. They can groan together. They can be creative together. There was just a buzz of constant energy and excitement in the room. And I think it's important for us all to remember, we want machines to be productive. We want people to be productive too, but we also want people to be creative. We want there to be some joy in a room. And I think that the future will give us the opportunity to bring the best of technology to a lot of interaction and bring the best of people back together at key times, many times as well.
Have you decided what percentage of employees will be back in the office in future? Are you going to poll your employees on this?
Well, the interesting thing is in 2019 in our campus, east of Seattle, we typically had about 65% of our people on site every day. I have always assumed that the 35% were mostly doing some work somewhere else and they weren't all on vacation. So, sometimes people travel, but, sometimes they were working from home. And I think that there will be more conveniences for people. It'll be easier for people to juggle. There'll be new benefits in many ways for parents of school age or small children. I think the real goal should be to make the experience better than it was before. And I think that's where technology will make a difference. Will the percentage be back to 65? We'll know a year after this ends, and then I'll be able to tell you with certainty. I think what we want to do right now is plan to make it easier and better for everyone to make the right choice for themselves, their families, and their job and their team.
Right. Speaking of Teams, we've all spent a long time on Microsoft Teams this year. But Administrator Guzman, if I could turn to you. Not every large employer works on a campus has a campus like Microsoft's, but so most small businesses rely on the vibrancy of cities. And when those downtown offices and big cultural attractions closed down more than a year ago, many of the smallest businesses were most directly affected. If it's true that the smallest businesses are those that add to the vibrancy of a city, food carts, the cafes, the mom and pop shops, etc., how's the Small Business Administration working to increase the resiliency of these businesses? And where do you see the most innovation? Where do you see the most need for support?
Well, I think all of America has really been inspired by the creativity, the ingenuity, the determination that we've seen across our nation's small businesses. They've really had to, in the face of so many unknowns, pivot and adapt. Those are the buzzwords for them, to do business in this new environment. The cities have changed. The main streets that they operated have changed. And so they've had to, with loss of revenues and rising debt and expenses, pivoted and adapted. And if you look even just at our food and beverage businesses as an example, when lockdowns forced them to shut their doors and so many of their customers disappeared, no more afternoon lunches from all the local businesses, they adapted with technology at really high rates. I think that's one of the silver linings of COVID pandemic. And like so many businesses, and with them, they met that new demand for takeout and delivery, just leveraging those e-commerce tools and social media tools to meet their customers in new ways, since it couldn't be live in person. But still others, even who couldn't adapt completely with technology in that takeout model, maybe they did pop-up kitchens or other things similar. And we saw local and state governments step up as well, making way for that innovation of al fresco dining and closing off streets and modifying alcohol licensing so that they could do delivery. Just little things like that, which really helped that industry. And I think, across the board, we see that. We had a great example of a restaurant that leveraged one of our programs recently, Chasing Sage. They're in Charleston, South Carolina. They were actually slated to open in March 2020 when the pandemic hit. And so they had to quickly pivot, create a pop-up series using a whole different menu because people were also changing their needs and wants during that time if it was going to be convenient takeout. So did all vegetable ramen, a totally different concept than the one they had planned, but just to survive, during that time. And I think, my goal is to support that kind of innovation that we see across our small businesses and what they learn how to adapt. And so SBA is in itself adapting. We're an agile small agency, but we're newly scaled from a 40 billion to a trillion, over a trillion. And we have to be as entrepreneurial as the entrepreneurs we serve, administering these multiple relief programs like PPP and EIDL, the Restaurants Revitalization Fund, or shuttered venues. And so I think what's really critical is that we all work together, cities, states, federal government, to leverage private partnerships as well, these public-private partnerships. And arguably, SBA demonstrates one of the best public-private partnerships in history with its guaranteed lending programs with financial institutions. And we tried to do that with our restaurant program as well, and used Square and Toast and Aloha and Clover to meet these small businesses where they were at point-of-sale vendors. So that they could connect to our application portal with data that was already there at their fingertips. And so those types of partnerships and being creative and innovative to meet businesses where they are is really what we're going to have to do as an agency. And I think across the board, we can deploy really rich, customer-centric, technology-driven, and equity-focused priorities to help some of these businesses overcome the barriers they've experienced.
Thank you. Thank you for that framing. Mary Kay, Henry, if I could turn to you. Essential workers, we've heard more about them in the past year than we ever have, I think. They're disproportionately working class. They're often disproportionately people of color. They typically didn't have the choice of working remotely on Microsoft Teams. Instead, they bore much of the burden of keeping our cities running and our lives sort of manageable. What do you think the pandemic exposed about the role that essential workers play in our cities? And do you think this new focus on essential workers that we've had in the past year is going to actually lead to lasting change in how they're treated? Or is that momentum in danger of ebbing as our cities return to some version of normality?
Thanks, Andrew. I'm glad to be on this panel. It's COVID-19 did what I think you said when the panel opened. It crystallized the structural inequity that has existed in our economy for all low-wage workers who used to be underpaid and undervalued and became essential during the pandemic, as you said. And I think it demonstrated that it's time to unrig the rules and make sure that working people can be respected, protected, and paid in the jobs they do every day. And I want to applaud Microsoft. They were the first corporation to keep our contracted security officers and janitors on payroll, even when the campus shut down in those early weeks, when it was unclear whether people should be reporting to work or not. And it was an example of what workers in other countries around the world were able to get, which is just have their paychecks continue so that there wasn't a disruption. They didn't have to figure out how to file for unemployment, and had some stabilities in their lives as they then returned to work. So that's the kind of example that would be great to have as a standard across the industry, in addition to the personal protective equipment that was needed, and to be paid a living wage. We have too many working people still working 2 and 3 jobs for less than $15 an hour, primarily Black and brown workers that need to have a living wage. And that's why companies like United Airlines, who got hit in this pandemic, the government helped last year, need to do right by the contracted out workers that they employed, and pay those workers a living wage and allow them the right to join together in a union.
Brad, do you want to just explain why Microsoft made that decision to keep janitors and other kind of essential staff on staff during the pandemic?
Well, we just felt immediately, really, that these were the workers who were most at risk. We have several thousand individuals like this who, as you heard, they're the ones who serve our employees food. They keep the offices clean. They keep them safe and secure. They let people in as receptionists, but they do work on an hourly basis. And so we decided one day, literally after sending our employees home, that we would pay them throughout, and we still are today. We've spent more than $200 million as a company to continue to pay people, even though their services, couldn't be put to work. And I think, frankly, all of our employees feel proud of that. Now, I hasten to add, we can afford to do that, and a small business obviously may be in a different situation. But I like the word crystallize. There were a lot of things that were true before that we just now understand better. Broadband was critical. It is critical. These workers were essential. They are essential. We need to treat people well if we want to build a thriving company. I'll say whether you're large or small. And I think these are lessons I hope we'll take with us as we go into the future.
So one of the things that we accepted as true before the pandemic was whenever we met for a panel like this on the workforce and our global cities was there's a huge scramble for talent, for top talent, and a huge need to upskill people to provide the kind of talent that the next decade or more is going to require, and that has clearly been heightened by the pandemic. Now, this issue of top talent looks very different for the different sectors you represent, I think. So if I can sort of ask for your views separately. Brad, I will start with you on this. Last summer, Microsoft launched an initiative to help 25 million people worldwide acquire the digital skills needed for a 21st century economy. You recently updated this with an announcement with the CEO of LinkedIn, I believe. Can you tell us about where Microsoft's plans are now for providing digital skills around the globe and how the pandemic has changed them?
Yes, certainly. I mean, in brief, we've now actually provided, since we kicked off this program last July, digital skilling assistance, access to free content, low-cost subsidized certifications and the like, to more than 37 million people worldwide, almost 10 million of whom are in the United States. And we're counting country by country and really trying to learn from all of these experiences. When I step back from that and think about this topic, say the workforce more broadly, I think there's three things worth noting. One, we are now in a decade where, frankly, all of us, it doesn't even matter what our job is, are probably going to need to master some more digital skills in the coming years. That's just the nature of how technology is continuing to change people's jobs. Second, I think there's a particular role and even responsibility for employers to invest in the skilling and training of their employees. And it's really interesting when you step back and look at this. Between 1980 and the year 2000, employers across the country, really around the world, increased their investments in the skilling of their people. This is when the PC entered the workplace. People had to use email or calendaring or Microsoft Word. And so employers figured they needed to help their employees learn this. Well, we got to the year 2000 and everybody sort of figured, well, we sort of know this. People can figure it out on their own. They'll watch a YouTube video. And so for 20 years, we've seen employer investments in training first fall and then stagnate. This needs to change. And I think all of us as employers need to think again about how we will invest in helping our people learn. And then finally, the third thing, this is where the SBA, the federal government, I think has such an important role to play. And one of the things I hope is that as Congress considers new steps, like the American Jobs Plan, which we strongly support, it will think about whether there is a role for tax credits to small businesses who want to spend more on the training of their people. Big companies, we have the wherewithal. Small companies, that's where we as a country should really think and talk more about how we can help every small business invest in their people.
Administrator Guzman, do you want to pick up on that? I mean, you've talked already about this public-private partnership idea about how government and companies can work with global cities. But what do you think of what Brad Smith just said there?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, we're hearing, such a mix of challenges for small businesses in this environment. Clearly, I mean, technology is a big one, as was referenced, as well as making sure that your workforce is trained and skilled. And I think, whatever opportunities we can provide, whether it's, local workforce dollars to help small businesses train, tax credits, et cetera. I think that that's a great benefit to help small businesses, but really always the challenge is connecting them to those benefits and those resources. A lot of times they don't know how to navigate government and figure out how to use those tools. And so we're really excited about a new program in the American Rescue Plan that includes a community navigator pilot program so that we can get more local with assistance to help connect these businesses to the resources they need, whether it be those tax credits or any other programs, so that they could better leverage resources available to them to help them grow.
Mary Kay, is this how much is this going to help your members? Are you kind of optimistic that this reskilling that Brad, this investment in training that Brad is talking about, what Administrator Guzman is saying there is going to help?
Well, Andrew, I was going to say that I'd love to build on what Brad and Isabel said, because I think it's really critical. Big employers are investing in education and training. I think it's really critical that we think about what Isabel just said about tax credits for small business, but it won't intervene on the structural inequality that 64 million workers in the service and care sector of the economy who are earning less than $15 an hour have. And even if their fast food employer or their nursing home employer or janitorial company does training and orientation to the job they do, they aren't being equipped with the digital skills that Brad talks about for lifelong education and learning, and the ability to have economic mobility out of the service and care workforce. So I just think we need to also consider structural change that would allow and the American Jobs Plan contemplates it. And one story I would tell about it is the $400 billion investment in elder care work. We have home care providers earning minimum wage, no benefits, no guaranteed hours, no paid sick leave. Most qualify for Medicaid if their state expanded Medicaid, so a lot don't have access to it. And a $400 billion investment would be a game changer for Black, brown, and immigrant women who are the majority of that workforce. And imagine if we could add education and training that would allow them access to laptops and digital phones to have a direct relationship with the primary care provider for the elder that they take care of. We've done pilots on that. They can't be sustained. But we could, as a nation, figure out how to invest in this workforce and in providing services to elders and people with disabilities so they can stay safely at home and live with dignity, and reduced hospitalization if we arm those workers with technology and raise wages and create secure benefits for the first time. It would be a way to include women that were excluded from rights in the New Deal based on race. Southern Democrats didn't want Black and brown workers covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act or by Social Security even. And this would be a huge leap forward for 2 million. And there's stories I could tell about the 4 million fast food workers and the 8 million retail workers. I think our imagination on education and training has to move from being job specific to thinking about the workforce of the future and how we unleash all this human capital that we have as a nation and really sort of set the standard globally for competitiveness and productivity.
What we're saying really actually
So
connects.
Brad, yeah?
I was going to say, I think what we're talking about here really connects together. One of the things that we found at Microsoft is we set up a mass vaccination site. Was just the challenges, frankly, in reaching these individuals who play this just foundational role in our society by providing care to others in their homes. And we actually made our particular mass vaccination site the priority in this part of Washington State to go reach these individuals, help them come in. But one of the things we found is that they don't necessarily have the same level of digital skills or the same access to digital technology, like a device or broadband and the skilling needed to make good use of that. That is something we all need to focus on. But there's this other dimension as well. I love that phrase, community navigator. when you look at the state of digital technology today and digital services, at one level it's ubiquitous. But because it's ubiquitous, one of the challenges that people have is finding the right thing and connecting the dots between them. So to have the SBA do something like provide a community navigator, just it can be a game changer. It's why when we look at skilling, one of the things that we've created actually has a pretty similar name. It's called a career connector. It's about helping individuals identify the job they might want to pursue, connect it with the skills that employers are saying they're looking for, connect that with the jobs and the employers that are actually hiring. So you just see how this economy is going to need to shift its focus, with a combination of private and public support to actually make sure that what we're creating reaches and benefits everyone.
Can I switch to, well, that's kind of a fairly logical follow-on, I think. We've been talking about the future of work since long before the pandemic. And I think, as several of you have mentioned, we saw accelerated trends in the past year in remote work, e-commerce, online learning, telehealth. After more than a year of adapting to the pandemic, how has your vision of a future of work changed? And specifically, if I could start with you, Administrator Guzman, we know that for our cities, small businesses to be resilient and to continue to provide the employment they do, they require access to capital, and that has been famously difficult for businesses owned by women, businesses owned by immigrants, businesses owned by people of colour. What's the role of the SBA in addressing that issue?
Right, on access to capital and really access to marketplaces too, and access to networks across the board, we've really seen discrepancies that have existed, and these were pre-existing the pandemic as well as heightened during the pandemic when they weren't able to connect to the right resources. So SBA truly is trying to look at all of its programs when it comes to capital and resources to see how we can transform and better serve the specific businesses that are highly entrepreneurial, those women-owned and minority-owned businesses, to make sure that we can serve them with the products that will serve their needs, especially in the financial situation that they're in, as well as be able to reach them where they're at. We've seen some really harsh statistics in terms of impact on minority-owned businesses during the pandemic, and specifically around access to capital. There was studies by U.S. Chamber of Commerce recently showing that Black-owned firms receive BP funding sought at about half the rate as white-owned firms, and were about 5 times more likely to receive none of the funding sought. I think that's why our priority periods in Restaurant Revitalization Fund, for example, where Congress mandated a 21-day priority period for women, veterans, and socially and economically disadvantaged businesses, those types of outreach efforts and focus efforts are so critical to truly helping reach these businesses. But a big part of that is that authentic connection, where local support and these local ecosystems built up in cities is so critical. And we're partnering with the U.S. Conference on Mayors and with local governments through our regional and district offices to really tap into those local networks to connect businesses to the relief efforts that we have, as well as the capital, and understand their needs to meet them where they're at.
So Mary Kay, if I could switch to you, you co-authored a piece back in March for the San Francisco Chronicle about how the pandemic has forced us all to reimagine the future of work. And some of those suggestions that you listed are based on the work of Governor Newsom's Future of Work Commission, which you co-chaired. Can you just recap for us what some of those suggestions are, and tell us how optimistic you're feeling about receiving the support they'll need to actually go into effect?
Well, the commission was like this panel. It brought together a diverse set of experiences from business, higher education, community groups, trade unions, and government. And those are constituents in our civil society that don't often see eye to eye. But a year-long commission created the level of trust and understanding and a shared analysis of what the structural problems are that made us agree that we have to come together and create a new social compact in this country where government, working people, businesses, large and small, and community organizations have to reimagine how to intervene on structural racial, gender, and economic inequality. And I think Brad's story about the vaccination site is an example that would have been talked about at the Future of Work Commission, that we have to focus on Black and brown women doing service and care work and think about the way to equip them to create economic mobility from jobs that they are doing that are intergenerational poverty wage jobs. So how can we make care work, a living wage job, the foundation of the next most racially diverse middle class this nation's ever seen? And what impact would that have across the service sector if we imagine together about it? And I have to tell you, in the depth of the pandemic, when the 44% were staying at home, I thought to myself, this is a level of crisis where California employers, government, and working people could come together and imagine how we could create a California cleaning corps and get 2 million people that had just filed for unemployment into good janitorial jobs where they were trained to do COVID-safe cleaning. I think there's things that we need to imagine, especially as this nation confronts multiple crises at the same time, about how to unite business investment, government investment, and the deep desire that working people have to do one job and lead a decent life. And a key ingredient that the commission agreed on was that workers have to have a say. There has to be a way for working people to have a seat at the table through an organization as a way to advocate for themselves, their families, and the services that they provide.
So, Brad, I want to just end with a final question about affordability, which is something we haven't talked much about on this panel, but I know back in 2019, Microsoft pledged hundreds of millions of dollars to help provide more affordable housing in and around Seattle, where you're headquartered. And I dug up what you said at the time, and you said it would help the people who are going to teach our kids in schools and put out fires in our houses and keep us alive in the hospital, which now feels doubly relevant, so they didn't have to spend 4 hours every day getting to and from work. To what extent do we need to be thinking about the affordability of our cities, where work has been clustered for so many years? And how much should our thinking be guided by our thinking about the future of work, about how many people are going to be able to work remotely now rather than clustered in big cities like expensive cities like Seattle?
Well, I think that the affordability of housing is just critical, and to some degree it's at a crisis point in many cities across the United States. It may be possible for more people to work remotely. That may alleviate some of this pressure. But I think it would be misguided for us to assume that this problem is going to take care of itself. I think that the challenge it's creating in many ways is that for many of our essential workers, the people who drive our buses, who teach our children, who police our streets, who put out fires if one breaks out, are having to commute for, say, 90 minutes or longer each way to and from their job. That takes a huge toll on their personal lives. It impacts their families, but it also, I just think, saps the vitality of our communities. I think we should all want to live in a place where our teachers can be our neighbors, where our nurses can send their children to our schools, where we all benefit from the common bonds that I think, frankly, have always been part of the social fabric of this country. That is under stress, it's under duress. It will take more money, it will take new investment, it will take new policy initiatives at the federal, at the state, and perhaps most especially at the local level. And so I think it's right that before we just conclude a conversation about the future of work, we think about what it will mean for the future of where people need to live as well.
Great. Well, I'm struck by the kind of tone coming through from the three of you that this, after the extraordinary challenges of this year, it's also shown up the opportunity for a rethink on some of these big systemic questions that we've been tackling here. And I'm also struck by that the theme that's come through about the need for partnership between the different groups that you represent, government, labour, business, and of course our cities. So I think these are going to be themes that are with us for a long time. But I want to wrap up just by thanking the three of you, Administrator Guzman, Mary Kay Henry, Brad Smith, and now back to you, Ivo, in the studio.
Thank you, Edge. And thank you, Isabella, Mary Kay, and Brad, for sharing your thoughts on how we can ensure a resilient post-COVID workforce and workplace. Before we move on, don't forget to follow us on Twitter @_Global Cities. The travel, hospitality, and cultural sectors were some of the hardest hit by the pandemic, with flights, tourism, concerts, exhibits, and shows grinding to a halt across cities worldwide. Things are beginning to change. Nearly 2 million Americans boarded flights this past Memorial Day weekend. Exotic locations like Iceland, Croatia, and Greece are opening back up for travel. And Hamilton will return to Broadway in September. For a look at how travel and art connect people, I'm pleased to introduce Sherry Dobbin, partner at Future City and chair of Urban Art Forum UK. Sherry will be joined in conversation by Scott Kirby, CEO of United Airlines, and Justine Simons, London's Deputy Mayor for Culture and Creative Industries, and the founder and chair of World Cities Culture Forum, representing cultural sectors in 40 member cities.
Well, thank you, Ivo. We're here now with Justine Simons, who's the Deputy Mayor for Culture and Creative Industries in London, and Scott Kirby, who's the CEO of United Airlines. I wanted to begin this talk about play with two quotations. One's from an artist named Stephen Lambert, and he has this artwork in my home that he gifted to me that says, "Utopia translates to not place. Utopia is not a destination, but a direction." And another one from Trevor Noah, which is, "Traveling is the antidote to ignorance. It changes your mind, your perspective, how you believe, and what you believe." These thoughts can be literal or they can be metaphorical connections between our two speakers' agendas. We can travel or we can journey, both on a plane, but also through artwork or film, a fashion show, busking, many ways. And after lockdown, we see that people immediately leap towards culture and booking their travel as soon as possible. So over these last 16 months, the pandemic has severely impacted both of your sectors. Photographs from around the world have left people marveling at cities and what they look like when there aren't people moving around, when they aren't active and engaging in these aspects. And when we were refused to travel and being unable to gather and go indoors, we really established this global benchmark of what it's like when there's an absence, actually, of your core missions. So I guess people really want to know, what have you learned from this? So Justine, if I can start with you, can you tell us what you've learned from your global colleagues, and then how London has chosen to respond to this, to reinvigorate the city through arts and culture? And also, is there any way that you've been able to incorporate the progressive social and political movements that have also been erupting, throughout this time?
Thanks, Sherry. Yeah, to your point, I think sometimes we only realise the full value of something when it's gone. And I think that's been a real lesson for us, hasn't it, in this pandemic. I've had the real privilege, actually, of having a fantastic global network of peers through the World Cities Culture Forum, which is a network of 40 cities that I chair. And so, a highly unusual situation is that we've all been on the same journey as city leaders through this pandemic, albeit at different kind of points in the pandemic. There has been a kind of shared challenge that we've been working through in live time, in real time. And I've hosted about 15 webinars with 40 city leaders during the pandemic. What I thought I'd do is kind of try and distill for you all of those conversations into the top kind of 5 takeaways, the things that we've all got in common that we're all worried about. So I would say, number one is that, the pandemic has really reinforced inequity. It's one of the things that all world cities are concerned about. The best vaccination is actually wealth. in this pandemic. I think the second thing we've all been looking at is the rush to digital. You know, my entire world culture has really pivoted online. But what we've also been learning about and thinking very hard about is the first point, which is inequity. So in London, for example, you know, if you look at the people in London who live in poverty, 50% of Londoners living in poverty have no Wi-Fi. So whilst there's been this big kind of flourish around the digital creative offer, it has kind of amplified inequality. I'd say the third thing is about the labour market. In my world, the creative economy, it's quite a fragile labour market. It's many individual freelancers and artists and small businesses, and that fragility has been blown open and exposed in COVID. We've all been capturing the data, actually. All the cities have been kind of working out what the data is telling us about our industries in the pandemic, and also how that then allows us to make the case and design our policies. Lastly, I think we've been looking at unlocking culture, and we've been sharing a lot about how we make venues and festivals safe and how we model those different options. And, you know, a lot of us kind of rushed out to open things and then realised we had to close them again. So it's been far from a linear journey that we've been all on, but we've been capturing all of that and sharing that. And then finally, I think we're all really worried about confidence, you know, the behavioural change. How has the pandemic made us all feel? What has it done to our behaviour? You know, and particularly, I guess, for Scott too, the question about international tourism. In London, we're very reliant on international tourism. And, you know, all around the world, we've gone local, we've gone micro, we've gone to our doorsteps as opposed to around the world. So now everyone's looking to rebuild. To answer the question about London, very particularly, you're right, London, the central zone of London has been very hard hit by the pandemic. And there are three reasons around that. One is that there's not many residents living in central London, unlike other world cities like Paris or Berlin. So we haven't had the residents there. We also haven't had the workers there. And then finally, international tourists. You know, London is a city that is very reliant on international tourism, and that's collapsed. So we've had this kind of, you know, triple whammy of impacts on our central zone. So the Mayor and I recently launched a new campaign called Let's Do London, and it's all about promoting the centre of town, promoting the great culture, the retail, the hospitality, and encouraging that public confidence and that footfall back in the centre to get things moving again. But, you know, culture is really at the heart of that because it's the reason people come.
Well, and it's created that network in a way. It's probably also pivoted the cultural sector to be collaborative and sharing and wanting to give a solid, joined up message at the same time. And, you know, out of those difficulties, very often we become far more creative and also aware of how we need one another to survive. And I think, you know, what you've talked about, Justine, also, and this idea of being informed by data and unlocking these different inequities and such. I mean, Scott, you know, the global cities they're also for you probably the hubs, right? So they're a combination of your sector hubs as well as your destination. And I imagine that culture plays a role in how people are choosing where they go, and also potentially, you know, how this impacts the choices that families and work travelers have had to make. Particularly in the U.S., I guess we're more used to having to move around locally, you know, via plane. So I guess what have you noticed from your customers during this time? What kind of insight have you had into the industry, not just for the pandemic, but also what it's helping you to look forward?
Yeah, so to me, you know, this has been of course, the worst financial crisis in the history of aviation, and we've learned a lot about resilience at United Airlines and our ability to respond with health and safety protocols early on. Our incredible contribution to humanitarian efforts, which are ongoing. We're carrying hundreds of tons of medical equipment, oxygen canisters to places like India, even as we speak, and you know, financial resilience, personal resilience in family lives. One of the silver linings of this, certainly for me, has been getting to spend time with my wife, 7 kids, including one, my newest girl, who's a pandemic baby, I suppose, and 3 months old. But I think the thing that we've learned the most, if I had to, particularly in the context of this, is probably consistent with the quote you started with from Trevor Noah. which is human nature hasn't changed. As much as we get on these Zoom calls and do these, it is not the same as being there in person. And business travel, tourism, culture are about making human connections. They're about relationships. They're not about transactions. They're about the human emotions that you feel and getting to know other people. And here in the U.S., especially as we've seen the travel open up, we say leisure demand is back at more than 100%. There's huge pent-up demand to reconnect with people and to get out and just be with other people. We see the same thing beginning to happen in business travel. That's going to be a little slower until people are back in office buildings. But internationally, it's critical as well, because as soon as the borders come down, as soon as you're allowed to go somewhere, then you don't have to quarantine, bookings go through the roof because people are anxious to get back, reconnect, explore. As Trevor Noah said, to learn about other cultures. And that's the best way for us to unite as a world. For all the challenges that we have around the globe, knowing and understanding people. It's a lot easier to be online and be critical of someone you don't really know and you don't understand than to someone that you've met, that you've had a drink with, that you've shared a coffee with, that you've gotten to know. And so I've been saying it less artfully, but aviation and tourism are part of the psychological recovery for the globe as we come back.
Yeah, and I think another thing that we found also, what culture can deliver are reasons for people to gather that are not out of conflict, and where you're actually able to release emotion and positive emotions as well, and share in something that's positive. If I can just take you into a little practicality, just to follow on from that, Scott, can you talk about some of the ways United then has pivoted to help with their customers to gain that kind of confidence, to assure them? One thing that I've started to think about is that the age of the travel agent might be coming back, that we need someone to help navigate us through the complicated questions. But has United started to develop particular tools to be used that really help people to travel and encourage them to get out to these places again?
Well, first, I'll start that by saying how proud I am of United and our humanitarian response to the global crisis. At the very beginning, we were flying airplanes with 2 or 3 people on board, and those 2 or 3 people typically were medical professionals flying into New York, New Jersey, wherever the hotspot was. Our international airplanes had 0 customers on board, but the cargo bellies were full of ventilators and medical PPE. We carried the first vaccines of any airline back into the United States, and we've now carried over 30 million vaccines around the world. What we're doing in India. But we also made an awful lot of changes as we went through. Health and safety was number one. We were the first airline to require masks. And there's a whole list of the first airline to create a partnership with the Cleveland Clinic and to really focus on health and safety as we went through the crisis. But the other thing we've done is try to make it easy for customers. So today, the rules are constantly changing. It's a Byzantine set of rules depending on where you go. Do I need a test? Do I need a PCR test, an antigen test, a vaccination requirement? So United is unique in creating something we call the Travel Ready Center in the United app, where you can upload all of your documents. We can check your documents in advance. That's just an example of making it easy to travel. But I think the bigger and more enduring change is really trying to focus on making customers feel good and make the experience easy when they travel. And to do that, we've done things like the first airline to permanently eliminate change fees here in the United States. And we're running this program called Connection Saver, which those watching, if you travel very much, you've probably experienced, some airline running to a gate when your inbound flight was late and they slammed the door right before you got to the gate and left you hanging. We're saving about 1,600 connecting customers per day right now by having a new tool that lets our gate agents wait for those connecting customers and text the connecting customers. So all kinds of things like that are really about changing the culture. And it's not just the cultural changes that are easy to point to, like no change fees. It's about convincing our frontline employees that when we, the leadership, tell them we want them to do the right thing for customers, we mean it. Because if you're a gate agent and you've been forced to slam doors in customers' face for your whole career, and someone from management tells you do the right thing, you think they're full of it because they were. And so really about changing that culture. And I think that's going to be the most enduring change that we see, is the cultural change to really empower our frontline employees to take care of customers.
Yeah, and I guess while you're looking at being travel ready, Justine, we're looking at also being culture ready, right? And one of the things that you pointed out in the past is that the creative supply chain in London alone is worth more than 40 billion pounds a year, and then it's been hit really hard. What are some of the policies that you think city governments can implement to support this equitable recovery of the artists, the freelancers, the other workers in the cultural sector? What is it that we can do to really be culture ready?
Yeah, you're right. I think, as I said, the workforce in the creative economy has been hit super hard. It was one of the first areas to close, and it will be one of the last areas to open. Plus, the structure of the industry is all freelancers, artists. I think in the UK, 99% of the creative economy is made up of freelancers and small businesses. So I think that what we actually need is a paradigm shift around working conditions. There hasn't been this kind of understanding of the whole ecosystem of the creative world. So we think about what's front of house, we think about the people on the stage. We tend not to think about the people behind the stage, but it is, it's the whole cast, not just the headline acts that we need to support. So if you look at London, pre-pandemic, $58 billion was the size of the creative economy, and 40 billion was the size of the supply chain supporting the creative economy. And in the UK as a whole, the creative economy is worth more than car, aerospace, oil and gas, and life sciences combined, and growing very fast. So these industries are really significant, but because of the structure of them, they tend to not to get that level of recognition. So that's why I say we need a paradigm shift. We need it's a combination of federal and local government, depending on where the leverage is, depending on where the policy levers are. In London, it's a top priority for us, and the Mayor of London has kind of declared that it's a priority through his manifesto. He's recently won the election, and it was one of his manifesto promises to change the game on freelancers. And so we'll be putting together a freelancers charter in London, which we'll be inviting everyone to sign up, which is all about good practice, adopting good practice. Other things we're doing, which are within our gift in London, are we've protected a lot of affordable creative workspace. So a lot of artist studios and small grassroots venues have been lost in London due to the rapid pace of development, and we've put policies in place to protect them. So now in the Mayor's London plan, if there is a big development and there's artist studio spaces in that area, they have to be protected like for like and reinstated. We've put the kind of support and the kind of policy work around those important things. We've established a new creative land trust, which is an idea we stole from San Francisco, which is a social investment model to buy affordable workspace in perpetuity for artists, because we want the creative community to stay in our city. We're pioneering a new zoning model in the city. So we've now got 6 creative enterprise zones in the city, and they're places where artists and creatives can put down roots, because what often happens is artists move into cheap spaces and then those areas become fashionable and develop and become expensive, and then they get booted out. So creative enterprise zones are all about artists and creatives putting down roots and playing a kind of longer term role in those areas that they've helped to develop. So it's a combination of things, and then more immediately we have a kind of team called the Culture at Risk team at City Hall, which I like to call the bat phone. So that's more the front line. So we have in the pandemic we've helped over 750 individuals and creative businesses with all manner of crises, problems, through that phone, through that support, through access to services and grants and all kinds of things. So we're looking at it along a continuum. We've got the kind of immediate and then looking to the long term to hardwire culture into London as it grows and develops, because it's so important to our city.
That's great. And also because, of course, you're chairing the World Cities Cultural Forum, this means that is being shared. Scott, this is really good news for you because, of course, a lot of the reasons why people want to travel will be to go and do things and to experience things. I think what you can learn from this is that, the arts and culture sector sector is not passive. They're one of the first ones to jump forward with creativity. I mean, even in the first days of lockdown, I mean, major artists were promoting concerts from their kitchens and things like that. So one thing that's very important to know about our resiliency is culture is there and they're reinventing themselves, and these great cities are helping to do that. So this is going to be good news for your customers.
Yeah. And we look forward to them being back in person instead of in their kitchens.
Yes, I know.
As do all of us, I know.
Well, I think like Justine said, the great thing that's developed is there's a hybrid now. We're learning what we can do digitally very quickly, but we're also learning what's very, very necessary to be happening in life. And so, you know, travel is one of those supply chains to the creative sector and vice versa. And, you know, it might be that a lot of the digital, I think some of the research in the cultural sector has been, the digital is just what gets people excited and anticipate the real life experience. It doesn't cancel it out. And really what we're talking about, both of you, is thinking about cultural or creative placemaking. And I just want to leverage this definition from the Urban Land Institute that's used globally, which is intentionally leveraging the power of arts, culture, and creativity to serve the community's interests while driving a broader agenda for change, growth, and transformation in a way that builds the character and the quality of place. So I guess what I'd love to ask the two of you is, what is your commitment to connecting people, to facilitating this exchange for the global understanding? How can your industries work collaboratively? We've just got about 2 minutes. So I think, Scott, if you want to take us away with how you're going to help connect people and also connect to their identities through culture.
Well, painted on the side of our airplanes is the tagline, connecting people, uniting the world. It is the core mission of what we do at United Airlines, and we mean that and feel that. And we're the largest global airline to and from the United States by a pretty wide margin. And what we found going through the pandemic also is the huge desire for people to reconnect. We're anxious to get the borders open, to get people back. This summer, the number 1 and number 2 destinations to Europe are Iceland and Greece, which might surprise you. That's because those are the 2 places that are open. Normally, it's London and Paris, and that is people wanting to experience the culture, the history, and just the rich experiences. And uniting or connecting people and uniting the world is our mission, and we're anxious to get back to doing it 100% as soon as we're allowed to safely.
And Justine, you've listed a lot of very specific efforts, but you have this opportunity now. Is there something that can help the city and the cultural sector of the city to have a closer connection with travel to help us get about?
Yeah, I mean, for us, for me, and for everyone who's part of the World Cities Culture Forum, we see culture as the golden thread in cities, you know, threading through everything. It's not in a silo, it's part of our life and it's part of the fabric of our cities. So whether that's playing a role in the economy, driving international tourism, you know, breathing life into urban areas that need some love, helping with our health as a nation, you know, it's that golden thread, and that's very much how we see it. I think, you know, you talked about it at the start, you know, what this boils down to, I think, is human connection. And culture is all about human connection. And we've seen that through a very personal way in the pandemic. So we've seen people kind of really reach for poetry, for music, for painting, for film, and it's brought us solace. And it's brought us entertainment, and it's brought us distraction, and it's helped us through this pandemic. But culture in real life is even more powerful because it builds those bridges. It brings people together in that one place at that one time. We're all sitting in a theatre on the same emotional journey of the play as everyone else. We're all in the field, you know, kind of dancing up and down to some great music. And that is the human condition. That's what we need, that we are human beings. And so, you know, for all of us at the World Cities Forum, you know, culture is a human right. And that's what we have to hold in our hearts as we move forward post-pandemic.
That's wonderful. And it just goes to show that what this pandemic has brought us is it's not enough to just be doing what we do in our own sector. It's understanding the human nature and the experience and how that works in concert. So I want to thank you, Justine and Scott, for taking time out to be able to do this. And I pass it back to Ivo and the very, very full program at the Pritzker Forum.
Thank you, Scott, Justine, and Sherry, for that wonderful and hopeful conversation about the role travel and culture play in connecting us to each other and to our humanity. And now for our final segment, I'm delighted to introduce Governor Koike of Tokyo to share with us how her city is revitalizing its economy post-COVID and her hopes for hosting a safe and secure Olympic Games this summer.
Hello, I'm Koike Yuriko, Governor of Tokyo. President Daalder, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak at today's Pritzker Forum on Global Cities. Japan and the United States have a long history of strong bonds. Tokyo and New York City became sister cities in 1960, and we have cultivated our friendship in the 6 decades since then. We also have a cooperative relationship with Los Angeles as Olympic and Paralympic host cities. My honorable colleagues, now as exemplified by the holding of this forum online, the coronavirus is having a tremendous impact on how we live and work. I have been advancing various efforts that give top priority to protecting the lives of the people of Tokyo. Last October, we established the Tokyo Center for Infectious Disease Control and Prevention, Tokyo ICDC. Under this command post, we are engaged in effective and agile response to infectious diseases. This includes policy planning, risk management, investigation, analysis and assessment, and information collection and dissemination. In addition, in order to secure employment for those who lost their jobs because of the pandemic, we are advancing a strategy we call the Tokyo New Deal, Tokyo Value App Action. Through this bold initiative, we plan to create over 20,000 jobs in areas such as ICT and other growth industries and fields including nursing and welfare that suffer from a lack of manpower. Our goal is to achieve an early recovery in employment and the economy. Tokyo has been promoting remote work from even before the pandemic. Over this past year, the percentage of businesses adopting telework have jumped from 24% in 2020 to about 60% in 2021. We will strive to keep the momentum going and firmly establish this flexible work style. My dear fellows, a new trend is emerging in the world, that of seeking economic recovery while responding to climate change. The Tokyo Metropolitan Government is also taking initiatives for this sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. While responding flexibly to changes, we will build a resilient Tokyo that generates new value. In a session at the Leaders' Summit on Climate held by President Biden in April, I gave a message as a leader of a city at the vanguard of climate action. We had announced this January that Tokyo will, by 2030, reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% from year 2000 levels, and increase the use of electricity generated by renewable sources to 50%. A large portion of a city's carbon emissions originates from buildings. In order to reduce such emissions from existing buildings, as one of our leading initiatives, Tokyo has been conducting an urban cap-and-trade program, the world's first since 2010. In fiscal 2018, the covered facilities achieved reductions of as much as 27% compared to base year emissions. We are even providing New York City with this expertise. We must take action now under the banner of Time to Act. I'm rolling out a global movement to address climate change. Finally, let me speak a little about the Tokyo 2020 Games. There are now just 43 days to go to the Olympics. We will finish up our preparations for the delivery of a safe and secure Olympic and Paralympic Games to ensure that the Tokyo 2020 Games become a beacon of hope to people around the world. We will realize the Games' vision of unity in diversity and achieve a sustainable recovery. By doing so, we will create an even better future, and we will pass on this new model for the Olympic and Paralympic Games to the following host cities of Paris and Los Angeles. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Today, we imagined a world after COVID, a world where we were able to live, work, and play together once again. We heard from leading academics rethinking our neighborhoods and public spaces for the greater good and to re-democratize care and humanity through design. We learned how a large company like Microsoft is thinking about collaboration and returning to work, while small businesses are being supported by programs and partnerships spearheaded by the Small Business Administration. We also explored the protections and support our essential workers need and deserve to continue to bring resilience to our cities and humanity to paid work. We allowed ourselves to think about traveling to new places and enjoying a live show again, and about the role arts and culture, travel and tourism will play in helping heal us and bring us back together, both literally and figuratively. It's hard to comprehend what we have collectively experienced over the past 18 months, and to even begin to imagine a life post-COVID. Families have been forever changed by the loss of loved ones. Businesses have closed, never to reopen again. The way we work and even gather to celebrate milestones has been changed forever, and the physical landscape of our cities has been transformed. We as a collective humanity have been forever changed, as we should be. As Carlos Moreno put it, we have been accepting the unacceptable when it comes to certain aspects of urban life. We must honestly address the inequities we all knew existed and that were amplified by the unequal burden the pandemic bore on the most vulnerable among us. As Brad Smith said, the pandemic served to crystallize the things we knew were true before, that certain workers were essential and those workers remain essential after the pandemic, that digital access was critical before and continues to be of utmost importance now. We must reconcile the effects of 18 months of lost jobs, frontline stress, homeschooling, missed social gatherings, and physical separation on youth, on adults, and on marginalized communities. And we must acknowledge that the pandemic still rages in much of the world, furthering unequal outcomes and deepening divisions. As Justine Simons said, the best vaccination is wealth. Our goal in coming out of this pandemic must be to make our experiences better than they were before and to bring the best out of people when they come back together. The Pritzker Forum and other events like it are real opportunities to come together and work collectively to address this pandemic and other global challenges. Our next live stream program of the Pritzker Forum on Global Cities will be this fall as we pivot to exploring the intersection of technology in our cities with governance, equity, and resilience. Visit globalcitiesforum.org for more information and be sure to sign up for our monthly newsletter to receive regular updates. I want to thank today's speakers and moderators, our sponsors, and thank you to everyone who spent the last few hours with us. We know you have a lot of choices for where and how you engage, especially in this digital age. So we thank you for being with us today. Your support makes our work possible. Stay safe, and we hope to see you soon.